And a beautiful morning it is for November.
Yeah.
We are meeting here with our official recorder of our session, and so I want everybody to know that we're going to be on video. So maybe we can just do quick introductions to, so everybody knows who everybody is. I'm Nancy Waxstein. I am still the Executive Director of United Neighborhood Houses, which is a collection of social service agencies.
Ronnie Lowenstein, Director of IBO.
Don Boyd, Director of Fiscal Studies, Rockefeller Institute of Government.
Greg Walker. I'm Senior Vice President, Corporate Development for Sony Corporation of America.
Jack Krauskopf, Director of the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management at Baruch College, School of Public Affairs.
Deborah Golby, Chair of the Economics Department at Hunter College.
Lisa Neary, IBO.
Director Shaw.
Mark Shaw, CUNY.
Perhaps you'd like to talk about the Second Avenue subway, bring us up to date. Shall we go down around and start?
Sure. My name is Liza Pappas, Education Policy Analyst here at IBO. Sarija Subramanian, a Senior Education Policy Analyst at IBO.
Sarah Stefanski, I'm a Housing Analyst at IBO.
Sarah Sablong, Assistant Budget Analyst.
Katie Hanna, Budget and Policy Analyst at IBO.
Dan Huber, Environmental Analyst at IBO.
Michael Jacobs, supervised the economics group at IBO.
Stephanie Cranes, Education Data Analyst at IBO.
Frank Basilico, Deputy Director.
Tim Mulligan, Scott Stringer, Controller Scott Stringer's office.
Sam Levine, Manhattan Borough President's office.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So before we turn to our official business, I want to acknowledge the service to this board of Jack Krauskopf. This is unfortunately Jack's last meeting because he's been term limited out, I guess. And Jack has occupied the seat reserved for, or specified for, the dean or former dean of a school of public policy in the city of New York. But Jack is so much more than that, given his public service in both the governmental and nonprofit sectors. And I think everybody on this board would agree that Jack has been a superb member who contributes in so many ways. So I think on behalf of the IBO, Jack, thank you.
Thank you. It's been great to be part of IBO a second time, actually. And it's much stronger and better recognized this time around, which it deserves.
Yes, Jack was chair at a time when it wasn't at all clear that the agency was going to continue to exist. And, well, that may have been way more exciting in many ways.
You're more productive these days, no question.
Yeah, but I would also not necessarily say that your service has ended. Because, you know, we brought you back once. And,
yeah, right.
Yeah. Just keep us in mind. Thank you.
She's going to keep you in mind.
Oh, yeah.
And we will be considering the successor to Jack. There can be no replacement. We will be considering the successor to Jack in our executive session later on, and somebody has been identified, so which I think is positive. And so thanks again, Jack. And hi, Laura.
Hi, sorry,
you want to just introduce yourself?
Laura Anglin, former budget director slot. Holdover, kind of.
Never happens. Anyway, so since we have a quorum, let me ask for the approval of the minutes of the June 29th meeting.
So moved.
Second. Thank you, Mark. Okay, all those in favor? Okay, passed. Get that on camera. So, Ronnie, Director's report.
Director's report. First of all, I want to welcome two new staff members, Dan Huber, who's sitting behind me, who does environment for us, and Sarah Sayavan, who's a computer programmer who will be mainly doing SAS work. And we're also joined by Katie Hanna, who introduced herself a moment ago. She joined IBO last spring but couldn't make it to the spring meeting. And while I'm talking about new people, we are in the market for 2 new staff members. We're seeking an economist who's versed in tax issues and municipal finance generally, and also someone to do economic development issues for us. And if anyone knows of anyone, that would be great. Direct them to the website where all the information is now posted. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and highlight a few upcoming publications. You may have noticed that something came out already this morning. We'll talk about that later. The next fiscal brief that'll come out will be a close look at a relatively new economic development tool the city is using, which is called Build NYC. It was created in 2011 in order to once again allow the city to provide tax-free bonds for not-for-profits. The city lost the ability to do that, as did other statewide development agencies back in 2008. So Build NYC was developed to do that. That's good for not-for-profits who can once again borrow at low cost. But it's also good for the city's Economic Development Corporation, in that issuing these bonds has created a sizable and steady stream of income for EDC. These fees that they're collecting do not flow into the city's general fund, and instead can be spent outside of the city's normal oversight. So they're outside of normal procurement rules, no council oversight, and without some of the restrictions for community benefits, broader community benefits than the old bonds were required to have. So that's coming out shortly. I guess the other thing I should say about the piece that's, I think, for me particularly interesting is that it has an appendix in which it lists all of the projects, all of the studies and other things that EDC has used the build funds for, along with the dollar amounts that have gone to the projects. So just from an insider's perspective, I found well, you'll find it interesting. We're nearing completion on one of our biggest annual publications, which is our options volume, in which we look at dozens of options for bringing the city's budget into balance, either by raising revenues or cutting spending. It's one of our most frequently viewed publications. In some years, it's absolutely on the top of the pile. And it's a mix of things. Joke that it's got something, there's something in there for everyone to hate, and it always causes some amount of controversy when we release it. I want to stress that they're not, if you haven't used the volume, they're not recommendations. Each option is accompanied by an estimate of what it would bring in or save, along with a very brief discussion of how it would work. And then there are lists of pros and cons that are as close in length as we can make them, giving a dispassionate view of why you might want to make this change and why you might not want to make the change. We've got about a dozen new options in this year's volume, and along with some that have been very substantially rewritten. But everything throughout the volume has been re-estimated. So that's coming out soon. And the other big thing that's on the horizon is we're just starting our forecast cycle for our next charter-mandated report, which is a report on the city's economic and fiscal outlook. And when I checked in with the economics team the other day to see, how it was coming, and they're just starting to read the tea leaves, but I wanted to get some feeling for what they were seeing. It's clear that the city's economy is continuing to grow, but at a much reduced pace from last year. So if you look just at the period from the start of the calendar year through September, the city has added roughly half the number of jobs that it added last year at this time, a little less than half. The city's unemployment rate has continued to fall, but that's not necessarily good news, because what's been driving the city's unemployment rate down has been an actual decline in labor force participation. For the longest time throughout the expansion, New York City really bucked the national trend, and labor force participation here was actually increasing, and it's now very similar to the U.S. as a whole, which is a big change from what the city's economy used to look like. But now,
discouraged people not looking for jobs, that category.
Okay, or it could be people not coming into the market. It could be a mix of things, and I don't have that kind of breakout, and perhaps we'll be able to disentangle some of that when we do the report. Putting it on Michael. Okay. One of the few industries that's actually growing more strongly this year than last is securities, which is a big deal for the city's economy. So securities industry employment is rising more rapidly than last year, or the last several years. And profits of Wall Street firms, that's the generic for it, member firms from the New York Stock Exchange, broker-dealer net revenues, were actually really strong in the first half. So that's helping to propel them as well. The other big bright spot is just a continuation of the real estate boom. Commercial real estate is pretty much at its all-time peak, and residential real estate sales are close behind. And so, it's a mix. And as we look at tax revenues for the fiscal year, and of course the fiscal year just started July 1st, so we don't have a whole lot of information here. The only big revenue month is September that's come in so far. Collections are tracking what we had anticipated, but our anticipations were pretty modest. We were looking at revenue growth that was roughly half. We were expecting revenue growth for this fiscal year. It's roughly half of what we got last year, and that's pretty much what we're getting. Sales taxes have been strong. Property transfer taxes, as you might expect, really strong. But business income taxes appear weak. The unincorporated business tax is actually down from what it had been. And the general corporation tax is particularly hard to read at the moment because now that the general corporation tax and bank tax have been combined, the numbers are bigger, but you're not sure exactly what you're getting. And personal income taxes have been falling someplace in between. So all in all, it's tracking where we expected, but our expectations weren't very high at all. So we'll see how this all plays out, and you'll read about it in December.
Great. Any questions? Comments? Okay, good. So now we're going to have some really interesting reports, or at least interesting to me.
Okay.
I thought we solved homelessness in the Dinkins administration, so I don't know what's going on. Or was it the Koch administration, Jack? I don't know. These are really current, important issues, and I guess we're going to start with quantifying poverty levels in the city's schools.
Okay. Sarita, who you met before, is going to be doing a presentation. Sarita is a senior education analyst and the project coordinator for our education team.
Great.
And just the genesis of this project is every year IBO does a report on education indicators. In fact, this year we did 2 of them, one on the public school system and one on charter schools. And there were questions that arose as we did that about the measures of poverty that we were using. And Sarita embarked upon some research that would hopefully get us a better measure. So this is what she found.
So while we're interested in the family income, there are other factors that impact the student and help to form the student's identity, and therefore also impact the students' achievement levels. And in particular, we're interested in the impact of the community that the students live in. And so here we define the community as the census tract. And this map shows you the census tracts in Lower Manhattan to give you a sense of just how small a geographic region we are talking about here. So using data from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, we take student addresses in the 2012-2013 school year. We identify the census tract that students live in, and then we look at the income level as defined as the median household income of that census tract. And using that data, we create 2 measures. The first is a measure in dollar terms of the continuous distribution of community income. And the second measure is we look at the community income level and compare that with a particular threshold to identify students from poor communities. And I just want to talk really quickly about this measure, the continuous measure, and point out that we do take into account the fact that particular schools, for example, zoned elementary schools, can draw very heavily from a particular census tracts. And we take that into account when we calculate a weighted average student income for that school. So before I get to the school level data, I wanted to first talk about the distribution of students in the public school system. So this table reflects the median income of the census tract that students reside in. And we provide the distributions by borough, and then the final line gives you the citywide distribution. So the first column gives you the number of students within each borough and citywide. And the next set of columns give you different points along the distribution, from the minimum to the 25th and 75th percentile, to the maximum, to the mean, or the average student. And finally, the last column gives you a sense of the variation within the borough or within the city. And that column is simply, sorry about that. That column is simply the difference between, we subtract the 75th percentile from the 25th percentile. So a higher number in that column represents greater variation within the borough. So I'm going to start off by beginning with the citywide numbers. And I also wanted to note that this includes all public school students, including charter school students. So the average community income of a student in the city is roughly $47,800. But as you look up the column, you can see that there's quite a bit of variation across the boroughs. So for example, and the average student in the Bronx comes from a community with an income level of roughly $33,000. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a student from Staten Island comes from a community with an average income level of almost $70,000. And I'd also like to point out the borough with the greatest intra-borough variation is Manhattan, represented by the largest number in that column. And incomes range from a minimum of about $11,000 to a maximum of over $243,000. And looking at that maximum for Manhattan, you might be wondering, where are the millionaires in this sample?
Not in public school like that.
Yeah, well, that's a key point. That is very true. But to the extent that they are in public schools, they will be reflected here. But it's also important to keep in mind that this is the median income of the census tract, so it's less swayed by the extremes. And the Census Bureau also caps the median income of the census tract at $250,000.
So you're saying if everyone in a census tract made $1 million, it would still show up for your data as 250,000?
Correct.
Yes. So that 244,000 is virtually there.
Yes.
That could be any number. The actual median in the highest income census tract in Manhattan could be any number.
It can be any, yes. They do, so they cap it at 250,000. We actually do some cleaning of the data, and so for many tracts that have reported median income of 250,000, they have very large margin of errors associated with that. And so we choose, we made conscious decisions about making sure our data was the most reliable. And so we take into account the error in the estimate when we looked at this. So now that we've looked at students, we also wanted to look at how students sort into schools. And here, this table shows you the distribution of schools by the type of school. So we divide schools into two groups, high schools and elementary and middle schools. And here we define high schools as those that serve grades 9 through 12. And again, we report the citywide average, or the citywide numbers on the bottom. So citywide, the average school has an average community income of $44,900. But again, with a very large range. So the school with the lowest average community income is PS 150 in Brownsville and Brooklyn, with an average of $16,400. And the school at the highest end is PS 89 in Tribeca in Manhattan, with an average of $168,000. And these examples really highlight the residential segregation of students in our schools. And that's especially true, you'll note that these are two elementary schools. And since elementary schools are zoned, we see that much more prevalent in elementary schools. In contrast, when we look at high schools, if you look at the last column, you could see that the variation across high schools is relatively less compared with elementary and middle schools. And that's because high schools, because of the choice process, high schools draw students from many different communities. So now that I've discussed the continuous measure that we created, I wanted to discuss the binary measure we created in a process analogous to how students are classified as eligible for free or reduced price lunch. The key difference here is that the poverty threshold we have chosen is different from the federal or official poverty threshold that they use. We've chosen one developed by the New York City Center for Economic Opportunity, which is housed in the mayor's office, and it was established under former Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And some of the benefits of using the CEO poverty threshold include that they include costs of basic necessities, so not just food, but also clothing, shelter, utilities, and miscellaneous expenses. And they also adjust for higher costs of living in New York City. And one quick point of disclosure, the CEO poverty threshold was intended to be used with their measure of income as well, and they also take into account the value of in-kind transfers, such as food stamps and housing assistance. Because that data is not available at the census tract, we chose to use the median household income. But we still feel that this threshold is more relevant for New York City. And as you can see here, it's roughly $8,000 greater than the federal measure for a family of four in 2012. So to summarize how we created this measure, we start with student addresses, we look at the census tract that they live in, and the income level associated with that tract. And we compare that income level to a threshold and identify students that are below that threshold. And we aggregate to the school level to calculate the share of a school's enrollment of students that are below that threshold. And this chart gives you that distribution of schools. And so we ranked schools in increasing order in terms of the percent of students from poor communities, and we divided them into 10 groups. And the y-axis gives you the percent of schools that falls in each of those categories. And so the first bar jumps out at you, and that tells you that about a third of schools serve between 0 and 10% of students below the threshold, or students from poor communities. And to give you an example of why that's useful to us for research purposes, before we had this measure, in past indicators reports, we relied on the eligibility for free or reduced price lunch measure. And when we ranked schools using that measure and divided them into thirds, we found that a school with a low poverty level could still have as many as 70% of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So we think that this, for our purposes, is a little bit more useful. At the other end of the extreme, there is quite a bit of variation at the high end. So about a third of schools serve between 41 and 100% of students from poor communities. So I wanted to also give you an example of how this indicator was used in our most recent education indicators volume. And this is taken from a very dense table, table 4.10, that I've tried to present in a more digestible format. So this looks a little different than what you see in the indicators report. And that table looks at the proficiency rates for 3rd through 8th graders on the New York State English Language Arts and Math exams. So please keep in mind that this only represents 3rd through 8th graders. And so we categorized both students and schools in terms of relative poverty. So the first 3 bars tell you information about students above the poverty threshold, and the bottom 3 bars tell you students below the poverty threshold. And each bar represents the poverty level of the school that students attend, ranging from high, medium, to low poverty. And so what this graph tells you is that students are most likely to attend a school with a similar community poverty level. And this really shows the economic segregation in the city, as I mentioned earlier. So students above the poverty threshold are most likely to attend low poverty schools, the blue bar. And students below the poverty threshold are most likely to attend high poverty schools. And in addition, I'd like to highlight the top and the bottom bars, because we think that that's also very interesting. So students below the poverty threshold were less likely to attend a school with the opposite poverty designation. So students below the poverty threshold, only 4% of those students attended a low poverty school, whereas 10% of students above the poverty threshold attended a high poverty school.
Does this look any different if you divide it by elementary schools and high schools?
Well, so this is only for grades 3 to 8, so this
Okay.
is elementary.
But could you provide the same numbers if you wanted to do for high school?
We could, yes.
Is it in the report?
It is not, no.
But if you've got it, we could provide it if you'd like.
Yeah, we could, definitely.
No, I'm just curious
Yeah.
whether selective high schools mix.
Yeah.
I suspect they don't, but I wondered if they do a better job of mixing
Yeah.
economically.
Well,
Yeah, we
high
ha-
schools in general, because of the choice, because it's not
Right.
neighborhood-based.
Right.
Yeah, we actually had it by the numbers on selective high schools a couple months ago, actually. And that actually did show that there is still segregation among the specialized high school compared with other high schools.
Yeah, and I used the word selective in the wrong way. He's right, that I
Oh.
just meant that there is high school choice. And so
Oh, I'm
kids-
sorry. Okay, yes.
Kids move outside their neighborhoods
Right.
for high school.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if you recall from a couple slides ago that when we looked at the school level distributions, we did see more, less variation, which indicates more mixing. Yeah. And so this slide gets into the meat of what was reported in Table 4.10, and this looks at the proficiency rates in the English Language Arts exam for grades for 3rd through 8th graders. And the results were largely the same for math, so I'm just going to report on English Language Arts. And in general, students above the poverty threshold had higher proficiency rates. And among students above the poverty threshold, those in low poverty schools had the highest proficiency rates. And the same thing was true for students below the poverty threshold. So here we can really see that regardless of an individual student's poverty designation, the poverty designation of the school really makes a difference in terms of proficiency rates. And here we think we're capturing peer effects.
And when you say it's the same for math, the math graph looks the same as this, or the variation between the different bars is eliminated with math?
Oh, it's the same pattern with math, sorry about that. In that students in low poverty schools do better. So in conclusion, I'd just like to choose some other highlights from our education indicators volume to conclude with. First, enrollment was down a tick in 2013-14, close to the 2008-2009 low that you can see in that chart. However, it's been hovering around a little over 1 million students for the past several years. But even though enrollment has stayed roughly the same, one thing that we're particularly interested in is the churn in the system and students entering and leaving the system. So about 14% of students enrolled in 2013-14 were not enrolled the previous year. That's pre-K to 12 students. And even if you exclude pre-K, we see an 8% churn in the system. Per pupil spending stood at about $24,000 for 2014-15, and that was an increase of roughly 8% from 5 years ago. In 2013-14, 452,000 students were in overcrowded schools, and here we consider a school as overcrowded if they're at 102.5% of capacity or more. And with the recent release of the Blue Book, which is the SEA's measure of capacity, we expect that number to increase once we get the data. Class sizes in elementary and middle schools have continued to rise in 2013-14. The average for kindergarten classes is 23 students, and the average for 8th grade classes is up to 28 students. And finally, what about students with disabilities? That's a very good question, and one that we have been trying to answer for well over a year now. And we have asked for data from the CSIS system, which is what the DOE is now using to track students with individualized education plans. But they have been unable to provide us with that data. And it's mostly because they say that it's pretty much a mess. So, we've gotten a lot of different stories about what they can and cannot produce, but at the end of the day, they haven't been able to produce it. And we know that they also, other researchers have also asked for it, and they also have not received it. So we'll continue to ask, and hopefully one day we'll be able to answer that question.
Well, it's more than academic interest for the department. I mean, the department's ability to claim Medicaid funds has been severely compromised, just put on hold because the department hasn't been able to get the data working. And it's quite a mess.
So that must be millions and millions of dollars then, if they're not.
Oh, yes, many millions. And the Comptroller's Office has been very much involved in this issue. Yeah. And so it's not just, the fact that it's a hole in our education indicators volume is annoying to us, but, from a broader city perspective, and I'm sure just the perspective of helping to best help these kids, it's a mess.
So do they have a plan or a process that's going to make it less of a mess, or?
Well, they've had multiple plans. They've always had a plan. I can't tell you whether this plan is any closer than the last one. Yeah.
You mentioned the churn rate. Do you have a benchmark from outside the city about what's a reasonable churn rate?
I don't. That's a good question. We can definitely look into that. We haven't looked at that particularly.
The other question that's related is, do you have a measure of how often kids switch schools within the city? Because they're not being captured as not enrolled, right?
Right.
Not enrolled means they weren't enrolled in any city school.
Yes, sorry, I forgot to mention that. They were not enrolled in any traditional public or charter school.
Right.
So student mobility is something else that we are also very interested in, and it's a very complicated process of tracking students. So it's taken us some time to work out the kinks in that. But we are looking into that, and in particular, with a LISA study that you're going to hear about later, we've looked into, or starting to look into the mobility of students in temporary housing. But yeah, that is something that we are looking into.
But
go ahead.
I assume the biggest part of the 14 is a mix of immigration and dropouts.
Wait, what did you say?
I assume that the large churn rate is a result of immigration in the city combined with dropouts driving those numbers. No? What is it?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it is. We haven't looked into what might be driving it. Dropouts wouldn't be so much the issue because these are really students that are entering the system. So 14% were not enrolled the previous year. But yeah, it could be immigration.
What else would it be?
Well, some of it is
temporary housing.
Some of it is high school students. So there are a lot of high school students that enter the system in 9th grade. So the number for 9th graders is slightly higher. This also includes pre-K, so a lot of pre-K students obviously weren't here the previous year. But even excluding those, it's about 8% new students.
But the main indicator, the education indicators volume has extensive information looking at mobility of kids within the system.
Yes.
So for each year, you can see kids going to another public school, kids going to a charter school, kids coming from a charter school out of the system into the system. They're complex tables to talk about, but a lot of that information is there and it's all quite current.
And just for perspective, the $24,000 per pupil spending, do you have the regular ed versus special ed numbers? Just
Let me see if we have that.
Yeah, that's everybody, and especially the number is very much higher.
Yeah.
Regular ed is very much lower.
Lower, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know if this.
If you can get it quick, if not, we'll give it to you
Yeah.
after the meeting, so that we can
Yeah.
move on. But yeah, we've definitely got the numbers. And Jack, I'm sorry.
Just a quick, the CEO poverty measure was from 2012, I think.
Yes.
Do they plan to update that on any kind of regular basis?
Yes, they actually have updated it. They have released the 2013 data as well. At the time of publication, we only had 13 student addresses, so we were a little bit limited from that perspective.
Do you know whether they're going to do it annually or biannually, or whether
They
they've got
do it
set?
annually.
Do you know if they do any New York versus elsewhere kind of analysis of that sort of measure?
I don't think so. Yeah. They make a lot of adjustments, so I would imagine that would be really hard to replicate for a city other than New York that they don't have the data for.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Susan.
Sure.
That was interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry Ernie wasn't here today. This would be particularly interesting. Okay.
And again, he's in Australia, so, you know.
Anything
Those were
to-
choices he made.
Anything to get out of an IBO meeting, really.
That's a good point. Okay.
Well, this next topic is of interest to many of us. Laura, I'm sure you'll be happy to hear about how Albany is shifting to burden.
I don't do it anymore.
This is obviously, as the cost of sheltering homeless people has risen dramatically over the last several years. It's of interest in who's paying for it. Okay.
Okay. I'm Sarah Stransky. I cover housing and homelessness here at IBO. And IBO recently released a publication looking at the funding streams behind our homeless shelter system here in New York City. And there's a general understanding that the homeless population is increasing, and along with that also costs are increasing. But IBO, we were getting the question, how much of this is city funds for our shelters? And we were also getting the question, well, what other purposes could we be using the money that we're currently spending for shelters? What other purposes could we use that money for? So we decided to write a fiscal brief sort of delving into these two questions that people were asking us. And the answer to those is tied to the funding streams behind how we pay for our homeless shelters. So I'm going to walk you through some key findings. So the first finding that we had is that family assistance, which is part of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF, cash grant assistance. So family assistance remains the largest share of family shelter public assistance claims. So we're using this family assistance as a large portion of our family shelter funding. We also found that federal funds are now covering a larger share of our family shelter costs. In contrast, single adult shelters are primarily being paid out of city funds. And we also found that alternative uses for our potential shelter funding depends on the source of the funding. Some have restrictions, some do not. So I'm going to walk you through some background on the current state of our homeless shelter population. As I'm sure everyone in this room already knows, the number of households in shelter has risen in recent years. So here we're looking at households, and it's broken out across the two populations that the Department of Homeless Services tracks in its shelters. So families in blue, and this refers to families with minor children and adult families, and then single adults is in brown. So we've seen sort of a historic increase in both of these populations, particularly since 2011. And 2011 was when the last rental assistance program the city had, specifically aimed at helping people move out of homeless shelters, was eliminated. This program was known as Advantage. The state cut back its funding for Advantage, and the city sort of left to fund it on its own, said it couldn't sustain the program. These numbers reflect the households in shelters operated by the Department of Homeless Services. It does not include households served through homeless housing for victims of domestic violence, runaway youth, or people living with HIV/AIDS, which are served through other city agencies. So as the population has increased, along with this, total spending on our shelters has also increased. And so here we're looking at shelter spending in millions, once again broken out across the two populations, families and single adults. So in 2007, the city was spending around $600 million for our shelters, and this has risen quite consistently to just shy of $1 billion in our last fiscal year, 2015. Now, reducing the homeless shelter population has become a mayoral priority, certainly, and the de Blasio administration has introduced a series of rental assistance programs, primarily the LINK programs, that's living in communities, and there's 6 iterations of this. And so there's this real emphasis of trying to figure out how to move people out of shelters and into more permanent housing. So our first key finding, public assistance programs play a large role in paying for our family shelters. And here, public assistance, we're referring to cash assistance programs. Now, the city wants to maximize its use of public assistance programs to fund its shelter stays. So the city is allowed to use the housing allowance portion of a cash assistance grant to pay for a family shelter stay. All people who enter the shelter system are required to apply for public assistance. And the reason why it's in the city's interest to sign people up for public assistance is that those program costs are shared between the federal, state, and city government. And so either the family shelter stay can be charged to a public assistance program where costs are shared, or the family shelter stay gets charged entirely to the city.
What's the breakdown of the share on public assistance between federal, state, and city?
We'll get there.
Okay.
I'm glad you asked. So hold on for a few more slides. Now there's 3 main public assistance programs that the city uses to fund family shelters. So the first 2 is family assistance and emergency assistance. These are federal TANF-funded programs that are targeted at families with minor children. You have to meet the federal eligibility requirements, and both programs do have time limits. Now from 2011 and earlier, these programs were shared costs. It was 50% federally funded, and then the remaining was split between the city and the state. Now the state had a budget gap and was looking to close its budget gap, and one of the decisions it made was to reduce its share here and move these 2 federal programs to be 100% federally funded. So to use more of the TANF block grant for these 2 programs rather than for other purposes that they could use the block grant for. So these 2 programs became 100% federally funded.
Just to clarify,
Mhm.
the feds give the state a fixed amount of money for a whole bunch of things.
Correct.
It wasn't that when it became 100% federal, the feds said, oh, here's more money.
No. The state just chose to direct more federal dollars to these 2 programs.
And the budgetary rationale was that this freed up money for the state, for things that were state-only as opposed to state-city, or what was the...
So the main change was that the state was using TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, money for the Earned Income Tax Credit, and so they shifted more TANF money to these public assistance programs and used state dollars for the Earned Income Tax Credit. And I think long-term they decided that was going to be that was going to generate more savings.
And they were able to do that despite the fact that the underlying allocation of the block grant requires the state to maintain effort, i.e. the amount of money it was spending on public assistance in 1996 when welfare reform was created. They
Yes.
still can do this with components program despite that requirement.
And was there a different distribution from this change in terms of TANF monies going to New York City versus the rest of the state?
I'll have to look into that. I haven't looked sort of more regionally. It's an interesting question. So at the same time, the state was shifting more money to the federal government for these two federal public assistance programs. We also have a state program called Safety Net, and this is for households that do not qualify for the federal programs. And it does not have a time limit. Families have to meet the state eligibility requirements. Costs for Safety Net were split evenly between the city and the state, and at the same time, the state chose to put a larger burden on the city, a larger share. So the city now pays 71% of those costs. So public assistance programs in general were affected by this change, but because we use public assistance programs to fund our family shelters, it had ramifications for our homeless shelter funding.
So can I ask a question? So in the TANF, the city no longer had to pay 25%, right? So
Correct.
so how does that balance with the city then having to go from 50 to 71? What was the difference in the overall cost to the city between those two measures?
So we will cover that in a minute, but the answer is the city saw a slight reduction in its share of spending.
So just on the safety net change, the state just can do that, that was not a legislative change, that was just how they chose to allocate.
In the budget, they write,
It was probably,
Here
it
they
probably
say-
was a legislative change, but it would have been done in the state budget.
in the state budget, they write the city is now responsible for 71%. So we have these three main public assistance programs. This graph is demonstrating sort of the distribution of how we use those three programs. So we can see we're looking at the percentage of family shelter funding broken out by family assistance, safety net, and then emergency assistance. So historically, family assistance remains the largest share of how we are using public assistance to fund our family shelters. And safety net here in brown is the next largest. Now, what I think is really interesting is the growth in emergency assistance here in pink. Historically, from 2007 through 2010, emergency assistance was very small, a few percentage of our overall public assistance funding. But with this shift to being 100% federally funded, the city started to use emergency assistance a lot more. And a piece of this is that family assistance has a time limit and emergency assistance has a time limit, but they don't count against each other. So as a family might have timed out of the federally funded family assistance, the city would then switch you over to the federally funded emergency assistance, or vice versa. So emergency assistance peaked at 13% in 2013. But then we see this large drop-off in 2014. What's that about? Well, the state noticed that the city was now drawing down a lot more TANF money for this emergency assistance program than they had anticipated. Might have seen that coming, but so the state issued a directive that clarified you could not use emergency assistance if the family's emergency, in this case, they're homeless and in a homelessness housing crisis, could not be expected to be resolved within 4 months. And so that wiped out pretty much the eligibility of many families that were being signed up for emergency assistance. So the use of that program went back to 2%.
Wait, could you explain that to me? That means that if you thought that in 4 months they would have a place to live, you can't give them a place to live now.
If you thought, so emergency assistance is time limited to 4 months.
Okay.
And so the city was basically letting you run your family assistance term until you time limited out, and then was adding 4 months onto it. Emergency assistance, if it was unclear, it wasn't specified, and so So when it switched to being federally funded, the city said, we have a family that is homeless, this counts as an emergency, we can sign them up. In 2014, the state issued a directive that said, if you believe the family will need assistance to address this emergency beyond the period of 4 months, you can't use this program.
Oh, okay. I understand.
We
I got it.
defined something as it was the federal
It
program
can't be
designed
like
for
for
emergencies,
Right.
and we defined it how we wanted to, and we're pulling back from that. Right, and I mean, but they're saying that an emergency has to be a short-lived.
A 4-month.
Yeah.
Has to be
Yeah.
expected to be resolved in 4 months, and with the average length of stay in homeless shelters continuing to increase.
Okay.
It's over every year now, I think.
For families.
So we took advantage of the loophole to get those, basically. Makes sense.
Not 2 years.
Yeah, that's right.
So with the funding changes, we also see that federal funds now cover a larger share of our family shelter costs. So here we have the percentage of family shelter funding, and it's broken out by federal, state, and city. And so we have this funding shift where we see an increase in our use of federal funds. So our federal funds peak at 61% in 2013. Now, you had asked, the city now benefits from federal funding, but it also has to pick up a larger share of the safety net costs. Well, the city goes from about 37% in 2011, and then as the funding shift takes over, the city now pays about 34%. So the city is a little bit better off. But the big difference is in the state funding, which hits its lowest at 6% in 2012. Now to shift gears, single adult shelters are primarily paid out of city funds, so these operate quite differently than our family shelters. So the state provides an annual grant for single adult shelters in New York City, and this is allocated in the budget every year. And the state will reimburse the city for 50% of its single adult shelter costs until that grant limit is reached. No surprise, the grant amount has gone down in recent years. It averaged about $82 million until 2011 when the state started to reduce it down, and it's now averaging about $69 million. So the state has reduced this grant amount that it is providing New York City for single adult shelters. At the same time, the single adult population has continued to grow.
And is any part of that state grant federal money?
No,
No,
it's state funds.
It's just general fund,
Mhm.
state general fund?
So here we're looking at the adult shelter funding in millions, broken out by federal, state, and city funds. So we can see that the state funds have remained relatively consistent and in fact have gone down a little bit. At the same time, the city funds have grown quite noticeably. So in 2007, the city was spending $104 million on single adult shelters. And then in 2014, the city was now spending $252 million on single adult shelters. So in conclusion, to come back to our original questions, how much of our shelters is being spent out of city money? And how could this money alternatively be used if we're able to reduce the shelter population, or if we wanted to use it for something other than temporary housing? So to come back to those questions, alternative uses for any potential shelter savings depends on the source of the funding. Now, we're not expecting any huge shelter savings anytime soon. The population is going up, costs are going up. But it's interesting to look at what this money is and how we could use it. So family shelter savings, any potential savings that we could realize would be limited by the federal and state rules. Remember that family shelters are primarily paid out of TANF funds. So we would be restricted to welfare-eligible purposes serving minor children. Also, the state controls how that block grant funds get allocated and would have to grant the city permission should we want to use TANF block grant funds in a way that we aren't already. Now the state...
When you say the state determines TANF, is it state law or state agency?
I mean, there are federal rules that overarching every state has to follow, but then I believe it's state agencies. I'd have to double check.
It's a block grant, so as long as you meet the federal requirements, you basically eligible.
The state has given the city permission to use TANF funds for 2 rental assistance programs, 2 iterations of the LINK Living in Communities programs. And these are 2 programs, one to help victims of domestic violence who are in the Department of Homeless Services shelters, and one to help repeat and long-term shelter users transition out of shelters. So the point I'm making here is that this TANF money for family shelters is limited. In contrast, there's much fewer restrictions on the use of single adult shelter savings. So a reduction in this single adult shelter population would largely free up city funds. And so these could be redirected towards any budget priority. This could include the construction of affordable and supportive housing, as many people have suggested, but it could be allocated towards any budget purpose.
One piece of data I don't think you had in the report is just to add together the costs for the family shelter and the adult shelter to see how much city money has grown across both systems and how much state money has reduced across both systems.
I could do that.
Do you have a sense of the relative costs of housing people in temporary homeless shelters versus subsidized apartments? And would it be cheaper if we could move the whole homeless population into real homes? Or would it be more expensive?
One of the challenges we have...
There's a supply issue.
Yeah.
I was going to say, one of the challenges we have is well, in fact, it may be cheaper to move people into housing through rental assistance programs. The real challenge is finding apartments to put those people in. The Living in Communities, the LINK programs, have rental limits where if you're in a homeless shelter and you're signed up for this program, go find an apartment for, let's say, $1,200, and the city will give you basically a voucher to help pay the difference between your income contribution and the rental amount. But it's really hard for a family to find an appropriate size apartment within sort of the rental limit of the program.
But IBO has looked in the past at the New York program for people with homeless people with chronic conditions, which has been traditionally supported by both the state and the city, but they're talking about a 4th round, I think, but not at a very high level. That could be a place where some of these savings could go if you can get them out of the shelter system.
Which certainly isn't imminent at this point.
Or invest in that system ahead of, with the anticipation that it could reduce the costs of the shelter system because it's targeted, especially the New York program, at the adult shelter dwellers. So that could produce some of the city savings you're talking about and state savings that would go with it. But so that might be worth somebody proposing. I don't know whether it's
basically investing.
Yeah.
Going forward. Yeah. Okay, I think we have just enough time for our 3rd presentation. Are there any other, other questions or?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the 3rd presentation is really brief. It's by Liza Pappas, education analyst. Education analyst. And what it does, in some ways, is combine the 2 topics we've been talking about, education and homelessness, into one very brief publication that we released this morning. It's part of our By the Numbers series, in which we try to tell a story with a chart or a table. In this case, it was one of each. They're really brief. They get a lot of attention, and they're, well, I think people here are enthusiastic about producing them, in part because it's just fun because of the visual component, and it's fun to get something out that you can do quickly. But I also wanted to say that putting out more brief publications is something that Jack, over a very long period of time, has been pushing us towards. So the whole idea that we created this particular vehicle has a lot to do with Jack saying, get out there more, do more stuff, do short stuff. And in fact, yeah, no, people really appreciate being able to see something and get it quickly. Yep. So, Liza?
Yeah, thank you. Sure. Jeff?
Okay. So thank you, Ronnie, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about a subgroup of New York City students that is coming back into focus, that is students in temporary housing. So this graph gives you a breakdown of the different types of temporary housing that students are in. This data comes from a residency questionnaire that is distributed at the schools, so it's self-reported data. The other thing I want to say is that an indicator of being in temporary housing on this form is for any one point of the year, so it doesn't give us information on the duration in which a student and their family might be in temporary housing. So the vertical axis is the number of students in temporary housing in 2013-14. Again, the latest data we have from the Department of Education. Let me first direct your attention to the purple bar. That year, the numbers were totaling 83,000 students. The other three bars you see are the blue bar, the red bar, and the green bar are distinct categories of temporary housing that essentially make up the total. So these are the categories that are covered in the federal law, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. The largest is the blue bar, students in doubled-up housing, close to 50,000 students. Does anyone in the room know what doubled-up housing means? Mark.
More than one family sharing an apartment.
Right, so shared housing, the federal law actually says shared housing due to economic restraint or similar reason. We have close to...
Does that include the housing authority? I mean, because I know that there's some reluctance to support not doubled up private housing.
That's correct, because it's illegal to share housing and NYCHA housing. But essentially, if a family reports being doubled up, that's how we would find out. But there are more families who are doubled up and do not report it as such. Yeah, for many reasons, right? We can think of other reasons as well, immigration being one as well.
Does the questionnaire that go home to be filled out by a parent who might know that they might not want to report this, or is it reported by a third grader?
The questionnaire is not reported by a third grader. It's reported by a family at the start of the school year. But if there's a change, if the family reports a change in address during the year, then they receive another form. So that says that a family has to report a change in address officially with the school for them to update the form. There's close to 30,000 students in the shelter system. And again, this is the shelter system funded by the Department of Homeless Services. And the green bar represents a smaller number of students in other kinds of temporary housing situations. Students that are awaiting foster care placement. Students that may be in hotels or motels. Students that report living in an other temporary situation, which may mean on the street or in a car or abandoned property. Again, if they report it as such. So just to take a minute to linger on like what this might mean for a young person, right? So this graph shows the short-term growth of this subpopulation for the 4 years of data we have, 2010 through 2014. So again, the vertical axis is the number of students that have identified, again, using the self-reported data from the residency questionnaire. Same colors. First, let's look at the purple line, which is all students in any type of temporary housing. It's been a 25% increase from 2010-11 to 2013-14. So pretty significant. The biggest surge is with our students in doubled up housing, a 63% increase over that same 4-year period. What we see for students in the shelter system, again, just the shelters funded by the city, is it looks relatively flat, which does seem counterintuitive. We believe this is representative of the availability of beds, and as Jack, I think, mentioned, I think the shelter stay in this year, in 2013-14, for a family was 427 days, so just slightly over 14 months. The students in all other temporary housing categories, we see a slight dip. That could mean that schools are reclassifying them in another category. Again, I'm just warning us about how much we can know with this questionnaire. So I want us to look at the concentration of students in temporary housing in New York City schools, because we think a lot about the concentration of lots of subgroups across the school system, but this one is particularly jarring. Here the vertical axis shows you the share of students enrolled in temporary housing in schools. For this analysis, there were close to 1,700 schools. These were just schools in districts 1 through 32. The geographic districts did not include the citywide special ed schools, the alternative programs, or charter schools. A lot of those schools don't distribute the residency questionnaire. So we've got the same, these are the two largest categories, right? So we're showing the distribution of students in doubled up housing, the blue line, and students in shelters, the red line. So let me just first direct you, about a quarter of those schools, 400 schools, serve a population where at least 5% of their students are in the shelters. And roughly the same amount of schools serve a population where about 7% of their students are in doubled up. But let's first look rightward. The vast majority of schools serve less than that. Close to 35% of schools actually have a population where less than 1% of their students are in shelters. It's about half that for schools that are serving doubled up students. It's about 17% of New York City schools have a population where less than 1% are in doubled up housing. So let's lastly look at the clustering on the left side of the graph, because that shows where our acute concentration is. There are about 120 schools that serve a population where about 10% of their students enrolled are in the shelter system. And there are 12 schools, say that again, there are 12 schools of the 1,700 that serve more than 20% of their students in shelters. For doubled up, the concentration is not quite as intense, but it is still disproportionate. There's still a small number of schools that are serving disproportionate number of students in doubled up housing. There's about 218 schools that serve about 10% of their population in doubled up housing. And there's about 34 schools where 20% of their students have been reported as being in doubled up
I
housing.
assume they tend to be the same schools, that is, if you're sure serving a lot of students in shelters, there are also a lot of students.
Some of them are the same schools, but not all, actually. And that's what's interesting. Quite a few of them are different.
So presumably, is it schools that are near shelters? Is that what's happening?
So we do see that schools that are near shelters inevitably receive, especially zone schools at the elementary school, receive a large portion of their students from that nearby shelter. But the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act allows families to keep their kids in their school of origin, which is the school they were in prior to being in temporary housing. So many families do elect to do that and travel great distances to keep at least schooling constant for their child. And so it doesn't quite explain that, because we have a lot of students in a nearby shelter who are attending a school nowhere near there. So this last table, well, I guess I just want to say, how does a subgroup of these kinds of students come back into focus for us, right? So certainly there's only a small number of schools in the cities that are seeing this at all. And I think one of the ways it's come back into focus is because the increasing tension of homelessness again now in 2015. I think the other reason is because it's not surprising that students who are struggling with housing are struggling with schooling. And so this table gives us, sort of compares some traditional academic outcomes for students based on housing type. So we have, we're going to look at attendance, suspension, and then test scores at the 3rd through 8th grade level. So the first, and we're going to look at it for students in doubled up housing, for students in shelters, and then we're going to look at their more permanently housed peers. So the first 2 columns in this table reminds you of the number of students in each category, and this gives you the number of students that were in permanent housing for the same school year of 2013-14. This also shows you the proportion that they represent of all students. So let's first look at attendance. I'm going to draw your attention mostly to students who are in the shelter system because I think you'll agree that we're most concerned about their academic outcomes. Students in the shelter system attending school at an average rate of 81%. So in real life terms, that is missing close to 40 days in an academic school year. What the DOE would consider severe chronic absenteeism. This in comparison to their doubled up peers, or the peers in doubled up housing, who are attending about 90%, and students in permanent housing attending schools like close to 91%. Look at suspensions. Students in shelters being suspended at more than twice the rate their permanently housed peers. And let's note that students in doubled up housing are actually being suspended even less. So we're trying to, that's curious.
They used to be in crowded situations.
Yes, okay. Yes.
Does the question that asks about doubled up housing ask whether it's, I don't know how to phrase this, voluntary or not?
Yes.
In the sense that maybe they're living with grandma because
Yes.
grandma's providing childcare and saying, yes, you're going to school today.
Yes.
Or maybe they're living in an unmarried household where there are kids from 2 families. Are they doubled up according to this measure or not?
Good question, Deborah. The federal law is purposely very vague in the way it conceptualizes double up housing. There's wide variation. There's certainly students who are living, their mom and they're living with grandma. We also have students who are living in a house with even 3 families, where each family is renting a bedroom and they're sharing the kitchen and the bathroom. The residency questionnaire does not make those kinds of specific distinctions. And really, what schools are supposed to do when families are filling out this form is to say, is this housing adequate in your mind? Is it regular? And that's supposed to gear how families report. How well schools facilitates families filling out of this form is another question.
But that's kind of the question.
For sure.
That's part of probably the only way to sort of ask that question is,
That's right.
Is this really what you want? If you want to live with grandma, fine. If you're living with grandma because that's the only place you can afford to live, that's different.
It's an excellent question. It's a tricky question to ask families. It's also it can be very intrusive. Let's just lastly quickly look at the the English language test and the math test. Again, this is just for 3rd through 8th graders. Students in shelters, only 10% of students in shelters are scoring at proficient or better on grade level. Really concerning. Students in doubled up housing not doing slightly better, about 15%. Scoring proficient or better on the English language proficiency, even slightly more on the math. Kids in permanent housing surely not blowing up the exams either. I think this was, remember, the move to the Common Core, and so there's been a lot of transition as students have been taking this increasingly more difficult tests. So, in conclusion, I think we just might, want to say, we see extreme concentration of students in temporary housing in New York City schools. We might want to ask, what does this mean for the school? What does it mean for a school that has close to 40% of its students in living in a shelter? We also see very dismal academic outcomes for both students, for all students here, but extremely for both students in temporary housing, but extremely so for the students in the shelter system. And so we might want to ask, what are the specific educational challenges that being in temporary housing brings? And so this analysis, as was mentioned previously, is part of a larger study that's intending to answer those very questions. So thank you for your time. This last question.
Thank you.
We'll come up with optimistic forecast at the next meeting.
So thank you, all of you who presented. Very, very interesting. We are slated to go into an executive session now, so I need a motion, I'm told, to go into executive session. Thank you. We have such a smart, committed group here. I knew that you'd get that. Okay, so can I hear a motion to adjourn then?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Okay, we are adjourned, and enjoy the season, everyone. The summer season.
Oh, that.